Harry S. Truman, a stubborn, quick-to-act, no-BS policy-oriented president who did everything in his power to defend the U.S. from the expansion of communism, who came down with an iron fist on any problems on the home front. His actions were criticized, and he ignored Congress completely multiple times during his presidency, making sure that what he wanted to get done, got done. Taking a shot of Old Granddad whiskey every morning following his morning walks, this president was an unstoppable train of action, a train without brakes or park. When compared to Atticus Finch and Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, both share striking similarities. Truman did everything in his power to do what he felt was right, stating that a president either is constantly on top of events, or, if he hesitates, events will soon be on top of him. I never felt that I could let up for a moment. He believed that as president, if one wasn't aggressive, they would fail in their job, and the country would go nowhere. Similarly, Atticus states that courage is not a man with a gun in his hand. It's knowing you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. In short, Atticus believes that even when the odds are against the person, they must try to beat them, and show courage even in the face of defeat. They fought for their beliefs, both never letting up. Truman pursuing his goals with the Do-Nothing Congress, and Atticus standing up for his beliefs against death threats in a racist Southern community. Both fought for civil rights issues, with Truman desegregating the military and Atticus fighting against discrimination in the South while protecting an African-American man on trial. Both men were powerful, letting their actions do the talking and prove that they weren't afraid to stand down. Obama and Truman began presidencies with similar problems inherited from the former presidents. Both dealt with wars began by their predecessors and continued to wage war against global threats, Obama tackling terrorism while Truman handled communism and set up U.S. foreign policies protecting national security. Truman set up policies, councils, and organizations, taking a hard stance against the spread of communism. Obama has followed suit, yet on a lesser scale, continuing Bush's campaign against terrorism and taking out Osama bin Laden. Both had to deal with an economy stuck deep in a hole, and were forced to try to dig the U.S. out of it. However, this is where their differences began. Truman took a give-him-hell approach, using his power to quash strikes that negatively impacted the economy, whereas Obama has tended to take a more cautious approach, trying to compromise to get things done. Obama's compromising is said to be because of a do-nothing Congress, yet Truman, who faced this very same problem, turned around the debt-heavy post-World War II economy and never let up in his relentless campaign to pass the Fair Deal, an extension of FDR's New Deal. While faced with similar situations, both took drastically different approaches, with Truman ultimately winning the prize for maximum use of power. Andrew Jackson was Truman's idol. Truman read all he could on this president, and his studies show in his handling of his presidency. Like Jackson, Truman had an iron fist, one that he wasn't afraid to use. Getting on Truman's bad side wasn't something one would like to do. As the workers on strike in 1946 and 1952 learned, Truman would simply use the military to seize control and threaten a mandatory draft. Jackson, on the other hand, took a more drastic approach, threatening to personally hang and use military force against anyone in South Carolina participating in the attempt to nullify the tariff to protect the Union. Both presidents were not afraid to rise above their backgrounds to protect the unity of the U.S. Truman, originally from western Missouri, broke the racial chains of the area and gave a speech at the Lincoln Memorial in a fight for civil rights. The fact that someone with Truman's background from western Missouri stood at the shrine of the great emancipator and said these things about civil rights was almost inconceivable. Jackson, originally from South Carolina, threatened them with military force when the state attempted to nullify a tariff that Jackson imposed. Both presidents had the courage to stand up for what they believed and ignore the Constitution to get things done. George W. Bush stated, "I'm the decider and I decide what's best." He took this mindset to the max and appointed himself as the decider-in-chief, feeling that commander-in-chief wasn't sufficient enough for him. With his new self-appointed role, he stepped on the Constitution and abused his power without a thought for others. Truman, on the other hand, knew his boundaries as commander-in-chief, yet wasn't afraid to abuse his power if the Do-Nothing Congress wasn't letting him have his way. Truman also took responsibility for his own actions, something Bush was never capable of doing, as he wanted the power of the presidency, whereas Truman didn't quite want it. Both presidents, however, faced similar issues, with both beginning fights against global threats, Bush choosing to fight terrorism and Truman battling communism. Strangely enough, both presidents also hold records in the approval and disapproval rating categories, Truman sporting an all-time lowest approval rating of 22% and a disapproval rating of 67%, while Bush held a 24% approval rating and a disapproval rating of 71%. Although they both were quick to act and somewhat stubborn presidents, Truman cared about his legacy and used his power to do what was right, whereas Bush carried out his policies like a headless chicken, disregarding any effects his actions would have on the public's view of his character or credibility. Truman's path to power was a short one. He served as a member of the U.S. Senate and spoke out against corporate greed, showcasing his liberal views. Truman eventually became vice president under FDR, both sharing the same liberal views. Upon FDR's death, Truman was handed the presidency and a nation in the middle of a war. His new job following FDR's death was one full of surprise and a lack of self-confidence. Miss Roosevelt claimed that Truman was the one in trouble now, a remark that certainly did nothing to help ease the man's worries and unpreparedness, with Truman later telling the nation that, "If you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows have ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Truman was fully unprepared for his presidency, being vice president for only 82 days, yet would surprise everyone with his use of power and determination to create an America founded on the beliefs of equality and equal opportunity, free from oppression and any foreign threats. Immediately after taking his new office, Truman was greeted by a new weapon, an atomic bomb. Lacking any prior knowledge on the weapon, Truman learned of the Manhattan Project and the new weapon the U.S. had secretly been developing. Truman's first big use of power harnessed the power of the universe, yet he misused it terribly. The bomb wasn't necessary to end the war, yet Truman believed that the Japanese in their conduct of the war had been vicious and cruel savages, and I came to the conclusion that if 250,000 young Americans could be saved from slaughter, the bomb should be dropped, and it was. Truman used his executive power to destroy an entire nation simply by pushing a button, accomplishing a higher degree of power than some presidents ever did with one simple movement of his fingers. Yet before the bomb Truman was already using his power to an alarming degree. Using his power as chief diplomat, Truman met with the Allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia to decide the fate of Germany following World War II. In a meeting known as the Potsdam Conference, Truman and the other Allied powers split Germany into 4 separate sections, one section for each power, so as to ensure that the country never again would be able to try to start another war or pose a threat. Truman had split a nation into sections with a stroke of a pen, showcasing the president's effect on foreign policy and nations. This pen stroke, however, opened the door for Stalin to make his move to benefit himself, eventually leading up to the Cold War and more opportunities for Truman to make his courageous use of power known to the world. In 1946, following the war, railway workers went on strike, causing a shutdown of the rail system of the U.S. Truman, already faced with trying to manage the economy and get it running again, took a harsh stance against the workers. Showing that he wasn't the man you'd want to piss off, Truman threatened military force and seized control of the railways, threatening to draft anyone who resisted. Claiming power as Commander-in-Chief granted by Article 2, Section 2, which states that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States, Truman stopped the strikes on his own terms. However, he abused his powers, as he never got Congress to approve of his actions. While preparing a speech for Congress to grant permission for his plan, he received word that the dispute had been settled on his own terms, and told Congress that word has just been received that the rail strike has been settled on the terms proposed by the President. This was a clear abuse of power, yet Truman made a necessary abuse of power, stating that that kind of strike can never be tolerated. If allowed to continue, the government will break down. Truman was quick to use his power, and even though he violated the Constitution, he did so to keep America stable and to protect the fragile economy. When Stalin betrayed the U.S. in pursuit of his communistic goals, Truman again used his power as chief diplomat and chief legislator to put new policies into effect to stop the spread of communism and the threat it posed to democratic and capitalistic nations. Frustrated by their inability to reason, Truman stated that, unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. Only one language they do understand. I do not think we should play compromise any longer. I am tired of babying the Soviets. With this thought in mind, the Truman Doctrine was put into effect, with a hard stance against communism and an all-out effort made to contain its spread. At this time, George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, sent his famed long telegram detailing that the only way to stop the Soviets was an aggressive policy of containment. This telegram heavily influenced the Truman Doctrine, as well as the Marshall Plan that followed. Designed to send aid to Greece and Turkey to assist their fight against Soviet influence, the Marshall Plan contained communism and enhanced Truman's already tough policy against communism. Truman's policies at the start of the Cold War would shape the U.S. foreign policy for years to come, and his power still held its grasp even after he was gone from office. Truman fought for the survival of democracy against an ever-growing threat of communism. He used his powers granted in Article 2, Section 2. He shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, and created UN and NATO. Truman signed the U.S. into the UN in 1945, pledging the country into cooperation with many nations to keep the peace and preserve human rights and international law. Later, in 1949, Truman successfully pushed the Senate to make a treaty with other nations, a treaty to form a military alliance to combat any world threat and to preserve the peace. Known as the North Atlantic Treaty, Truman used his power as a chief diplomat to create an alliance that came to be known as NATO. Considering an attack on one to be an attack against all, Truman hoped this organization would prove to be beneficial in keeping the peace and ensuring that another world war would never occur. In 1947, Truman passed the National Security Act, using his powers as chief legislator to create the National Security Council and the CIA. Truman merged the military departments of the U.S. into one, dubbing it the Department of Defense. Intent on increasing national security, Truman used this council to advise him on foreign affairs, domestic policy, and military strategy, while the CIA served as a new peacetime intelligence agency. Playing a part in Cold War containment strategy, Truman used the council along with his other policies to spearhead the fight against communism. Truman was plagued by a do-nothing Congress. Compromised mostly of conservatives, Truman could get little done with the group. He attempted to use his power as chief legislator to pass acts through Congress with little to no avail. Following FDR's New Deal economic policy, Truman implemented the Fair Deal, a series of acts to domestically reform the country. Most of the acts tried to provide universal health care, repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, which restricted labor and unions, and provide adequate housing. The majority of his proposals did not pass, however. In 1949, Congress passed the Housing Act, which provided public housing for low-income families. Truman's economic reforms were liberal and crafted on the belief that being an American is more than a matter of where your parents came from. It's a belief that all men are created free and equal, and that everyone deserves an even break. Truman's unsuccessful use of power in this case led to hardly any of his economic reforms being passed, yet like Atticus Finch, the stubborn and relentless man never gave up his effort to make America a more equal place, even when all the odds were stacked against him. The threat of communism was everywhere, and with growing suspicions of people within the U.S., Truman used his executive power implied by Article 2, Section 1, stating that the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. Passing Executive Order 9835, he issued a loyalty order to root out any possible communists that may have infiltrated the government. This loyalty order facilitated the removal of any communist spies and allowed for background checks to be made on people suspected of communism. This order shows Truman's aggressive foreign policy and use of power against communism, stating, whereas maximum protection must be afforded the United States against infiltration of disloyal persons into the ranks of its employees, and equal protection from unfounded accusations of disloyalty must be afforded to loyal employees. Truman wasn't afraid to do everything in his power to fight communism, even if it may have infiltrated the United States itself. Using his power as chief diplomat, Truman literally created a nation for the Jews. He didn't want to create the nation at first, fearing a possible war with the Arabs and the fall of the Middle East to the communism. Pressure from the Zionists frustrated Truman, stating that, I've had it with these hotheads, don't ever admit them again, and what's more, I also never want to hear the word Palestine mentioned again. Truman looked like he would never admit a Jewish state, but upon a visit from his old friend Eddie Jacobson regarding Truman speaking to Chaim Weizmann about creating Israel, he changed his mind and his ideas. Going from absolute frustration and disinterest in helping the Jews, Weizmann hit this tough president's soft spot, with Truman stating that Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it and I dream about it even to this day. The Jews need some place where they could go. It is my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness are not allowed to build new lives. Truman, like Atticus, ended up fighting for the minority and defending a group of people subject to hatred and persecution, similar to Atticus fighting for African Americans in a racist community. Truman used a large amount of executive power, showing that the president can not only reform their own nation, but can literally create nations across the world. When the Soviets began to poison their part of Germany and Berlin, gained from the Potsdam Conference, Truman knew something had to be done. With East Berlin under the Soviet sphere of influence and the borders closed, using his power as commander-in-chief, he organized an airlift to send aid over the border walls into East Berlin. Shipping supplies like coal, food, and medical aid to the East Berliners, the airlift was a massive undertaking. Nothing like it had ever been done before. The airlift only strengthened Truman's foreign policy and provided him with a reliable ammunition for his upcoming presidential campaign. Truman divided his background from western Missouri and took the helm with civil rights. Using his executive power, he passed Executive Order 9981, which abolished military segregation based on race and religion. Truman showed his colors as a pro-civil rights president and took a huge risk with the order. He knew that the Democratic Party was split on the matter, and with an election in progress, he could only hope but wait to see how the order affected his campaign. Truman took a stance on racial equality with this order, similar to the one that Atticus takes during his defense of Tom Robinson, with Atticus stating that, "In this country our courts are the great levelers. In our courts all men are created equal." Both wanted racial equality and fought for it, even though it cost both of them and had some serious risks associated with it. They fought tooth and nail to get their ideas out and worked to start a fight for civil rights. Truman's presidential campaign goes down in the history books as the greatest presidential campaign of all time. Truman, utilizing the full effect of the bully pulpit, persuaded the public with his all guts and glory speeches, adopting the nickname of "Give 'em Hell Harry." Campaigning with a liberal democratic mindset against his opposition, Thomas C. Dewey ran the campaign with the intent to destroy Truman's competence, using his lack of economic reforms against him. With the Democratic Party disintegrating due to his desegregation of the military, Truman was running out of votes. However, crossing the nation while giving speeches to the public on the back of his presidential train, Truman appealed to the common man, for he too was once just like them. Truman, however, was believed to have stood no chance at winning, and as a result, newspapers printed out articles with headlines stating Dewey's victory, but the votes were not yet complete. With an amazing come-from-behind victory, Truman won the election with 49.5% of the popular vote and 57% of the electoral votes, proving the power of the pulpit, appeal to the common man, and his tough stance against communism. This slide here just shows the votes and the distribution of votes between Truman and Dewey. It shows public votes and the Electoral College votes as well. Truman's greatest upsets, however, began his second term. Communist North Korea was attacking Democratic South Korea, and Truman, with his hard on communism policies in hand, moved in to stop it. Abusing his power as commander-in-chief, Truman called for unit intervention, not even bothering to consult with the legislative branch prior to making the decision. As stated in Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to declare war, not the President. Truman took an aggressive stance in Korea and set a naval blockade to defend the South from the North. When the South began to win the fight, Truman took on a rollback policy to combat the North and pushed the troops to fight back. At this point, however, China joined in on the fight, siding with the North. The U.S. and UN forces were pushed back to the 38th parallel. General MacArthur, however, wished to push back to force China out of the North. Truman resisted, and fearing that Russia would join in on the fight. This was a clear abuse of presidential power. Truman had no power granted him by the Constitution to declare war without congressional approval. This cost Truman dearly in the approval ratings and ended in a disastrous stalemate. During the Korean War, Truman added a new part in his foreign policy. It was NSC 68, or National Security Order No. 68. This 72-page formally classified policy statement secretly placed more money into providing for the defense of the U.S. It increased the amount spent on the military to provide an offensive and defensive force against communism. This policy would shape the U.S. future actions against communism by stating how to defend against and prepare for the worst possible scenarios of communist expansion. The policy also indirectly granted the President the power to protect civilization, stating that the issues that face us are momentous, involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic but of civilization itself. These are issues which will not await our deliberations. Truman expanded his power through this policy statement, and through it prepared himself and his successors to deal with the worst possible forms of communist expansion. Truman's approval ratings were low, but would only get worse. Distrusting his general, MacArthur, and fearing he was too reckless and would bring the Soviet Union into the Korean War, Truman fired him for wanting to attack the Chinese in North Korea. Truman and MacArthur didn't see eye to eye, and the last thing Truman wanted was for him to be careless and escalate the conflict. Truman had a meeting with MacArthur on Wake Island and discussed the war and the future strategies that would be implemented. He later turned MacArthur's awards against him and fired him. This misuse of power as commander-in-chief led to Truman netting himself the all-time lowest approval rating at 22%. When asked as to why he fired MacArthur, Truman stated that, "I fired MacArthur because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to three-quarters of them would be in jail." Truman had no problem using his powers to enforce his ideas. If he didn't like the direction a member of his administration was going, they would be fired. This misuse of power lost Truman one of the best generals ever and any of his chances at re-election in 1952. Truman ended his presidential career with a bang. Steel mill workers were on strike due to wage and price controls in place by the Korean War, and Truman, wanting their work to supply the war effort, wasn't having any of it. He argued that because their work contributed to the war effort, he could use his power as commander-in-chief to nationalize them. Falling back to his tactics from the railway strikes, he seized control of the mills and again threatened to draft any who resisted. This didn't bode well with the Supreme Court, who checked the executive branch, and Truman's plans were shot down. This abuse of power was deemed illegal by the Supreme Court on the grounds that the President's power, if any, to issue an order must stem either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. There is no statute that expressly authorizes the President to take possession of property as he did here, nor is there any act of Congress to which our attention has been directed from which such a power can fairly be implemented. This abuse of power sealed the deal for Truman, and the tired President, with his low approval rating in hand, declined to run again for his second term in the upcoming elections. During Truman's presidency, he began with a high approval rating of 87%. This was due to him winning the war and getting the economy back on track. His outlandish actions against the railroad strikes dropped his approval ratings, but his hard stance on communism and foreign policy kept the rating up. Following his election, his approval rating increased, then dropped significantly following his entrance into the Korean War, his dismissal of MacArthur, and his illegal actions in the steel strike of 1952. These events gifted him with a new record low approval rating of 22%. Truman was in all executive branch power. His dealings with the legislative branch were minimal, especially with the Do-Nothing Congress. He, however, got into some major battles with the judicial branch regarding the legality of his uses of power. This slide basically shows the interactions between all the branches of government and, I guess, the degree that each branch used their own power against the others. Truman's arrows from the executive branch of the others are really thin because he didn't really interact with them a whole lot. But the arrows coming from the judicial branch and the legislative branch are much thicker because the judicial branch struck down several of Truman's ideas and his, I guess, actions, especially with the steel strikes in the Korean War. And the legislative branch also kept him in check and kept him from passing any of his economic reforms with the Fair Deal because it was a very conservative Do-Nothing Congress. Truman kept his use of presidential power high, with low power levels present due to his inability to get things done with the Do-Nothing Congress, or the simple fact that some of the actions that he took had little outcome or importance. Truman was a president who was willing to speak his mind. He was an ex-common man, starting life little more than a farmer and a piano player. However, his approach to any situation was always one of action. He never sat back and watched from the sidelines or compromised. He was the type of president that could go before the public and explain what the people who are against him stand for and what he stands for. This slide basically has a bunch of quotes from Truman, pretty much express his personality, and just a few other words that express him as well. Despite not doing much in terms of economic plans, Truman did nothing wrong with the economy. Following the conclusion of World War II, federal deficit dropped and GDP increased. Unemployment was low, and the federal debt declined to 71.4% of GDP at the end of Truman's presidency. Truman's economic theories were liberal in nature. He wanted to balance the federal debt with higher taxes and limited spending, with his tax increases earning him the nickname of High Tax Harry. He used budget surpluses to help pay off the national debt and create the Office of Defense Management, which provided economic mobilization to keep inflation and unemployment in check during the Korean War. With the Do-Nothing Congress, Truman passed little economic legislation with his Fair Deal proposals, only managing to pass the Housing Act of 1949, which provided housing for low-income families. He tried unsuccessfully to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, which placed restrictions on unions and labor. To keep things stable on the home front, Truman ruled with an iron fist, seizing control of any strikes before they did damage to the economy. Truman was a no-BS president who wasn't afraid to tell anyone how he felt. Like Atticus Finch, he stands by what he believes in and doesn't fall to opposition, no matter how strong a force. Truman leaves behind a legacy of action, a president who is capable of getting things done and willing to speak his mind. Although he overstepped his bounds several times, Truman proves that if you can just make up your mind about what you want to get accomplished, you can always give him hell.